Thank you everyone for joining us for this session. And this session is a kind of roundtable discussion, so a little bit different. I'm not going to pepper you with slides. You'll just have to look at us for the whole session. I'm Fiona Calvert, and I'm the Comms and Engagement Lead for the North Thames Genomic Medicine Service. And even though I'm chairing this session today, I want to make sure that I highlight Amber, who's joining me up here today. Amber is a member of our patient, public and carer panel, and she's helped to co-produce this session. And I also want to acknowledge many of our other panel members who have fed into the session but couldn't be with us today. You'll also notice that Jason was up on this slide and he was due to join us today, but unfortunately he's had to step away today. So it'll just be the three of us. But we do have a fantastic panel with us today joining me on stage. So I'm actually going to hand over to them to introduce themselves. So Amber, I'll start with you.
Thank you. My name is Amber, and I've been part of the patient parent-carer panel, it's a bit of a mouthful, for about 2-3 years, I think. I came to be a member because I'm Freddie's mum. Freddie had Dravet syndrome, which is a rare genetic epilepsy. He would be 9 next week, and he died when he was 1. We had a huge learning curve to, I suppose, kind of get our head around his genetics at the same time as losing him, because his testing arrived too late to help him to control his epilepsy, and he died suddenly in 2017. So that is why I'm here, and I like to be able to say that I'm Freddie's mum. When you have lost a child, one of the things that becomes really precious is the opportunity to be able to take your child with you into other days, other years. And as we approach 8 years without him, it's very special to me to be able to bring him with me and share him with you and what I've learned and why I'm here. So, so that's me.
So I'm Harri. I am Eddie's mum, and that made me rather emotional because it's one that we've never met before. So I have the privilege of taking my son into the next day. So Eddie's up there. He is 10 now, but my experience with genetic testing came when Eddie was diagnosed at age 6 with T-cell acute lymphoblastic leukemia. Forgive me for any emotions. I think that intro certainly touched me, and also we're only 8 months post-treatment. So whilst Eddie is, as you can see, looking amazing, it's still all very raw, but that's my experience with genetic testing.
Thank you so much for sharing that, and I appreciate that quite a lot of the conversation may be a little bit emotive, and that's okay. That's okay. I'm Pooja Dasani, and I am a genetic counsellor. I'm a clinical genetic counsellor, but I also work as genomic counselling lead for North Thames GMS. And I am so privileged that you've asked me to join you here today. Being a part of your story, really want to listen to that story, share that with everyone, and if there's anything I can do to translate a little bit of that genetics, which is what I do day to day, that's what I'd like to do here today, and also share my experience in clinic.
Perfect. Thank you so much, both of you, for joining us, and Pooja too. If you need to take a moment at any point, please do. No one in the room will judge, and we really do appreciate you being with us today. So what we want to kind of chat about in this session is really how we as healthcare professionals can help families through this process of genomic testing. And so we've worked with Amber to kind of think of a few questions that crop up for families regularly. We'll chat through that, and then we'll open it out for if there are any questions in the audience as well. So, as you kind of have both alluded to, we know that when you're first introduced to genetic testing, that often comes at a really kind of complex time as part of a really unexpected healthcare journey. And I sort of wanted to ask, do you remember how the topic was first mentioned to you? And do you have any advice to kind of healthcare professionals in our audience about how to start those discussions with families during what is a really complicated time? Amber, I'll come to you first.
I think that my first conversation about testing was with a very noisy 7-month-old on my knee, throwing things around, being grizzly and upset, and it being actually quite difficult to have two trains of thought, one on his needs and one on actually hearing what I was being told. There's a difference between, I guess, kind of hearing and actually being able to listen. And I'm sure it's something that, anyone will recognise where you're speaking to parents, particularly with kids in the room, especially when, they are literally in arms. I felt that it was very disjointed, and even though I asked questions, which retrospectively I'm pretty proud of the questions I asked, actually, I felt like there was a reticence to answer the questions because it was as if there wouldn't be enough time because all of this was going on, and I mean a kid in a paediatric clinic, and I guess, it has never sat quite right with me that was our first conversation. Not only was it our first conversation, but we were sent for a blood test 3 minutes later. And I still have the sticker that Freddie was given that said, "I'm brave," on a picture in our hallway. It's fallen off a few times in the intervening years, but it was really memorable because we really didn't know what we were doing. I know that our situation isn't typical. I know that you would all want to hear that people are sat down and it's calm and quiet and there's a beginning of a conversation and a middle and an end, and that all of the things that you have in your minds as a checklist to convey, to do it properly, are done, but that isn't always possible. And I'm going to kind of skip forward to the night that we took Freddie into hospital, that Freddie was taken into hospital after we had found him. He had a cardiac arrest, and because he's thought to have had a seizure that we didn't see, that was very, very prolonged, and he was taken into hospital, and he was there for not quite 2 days, and it was never going to be anything but a catastrophic scenario for him from the minute we found him. But I'm skipping forward because I distinctly remember, I would remember this. I just wanted to share that we were standing in Royal London A&E with, kind of lots of things happening all around us, lots of bleeping, Freddie being resuscitated again. And the A&E doctor managed to convey, in a very panicked situation, with a clearly that was going downhill, with such clarity. I'm not saying it was, again, the way they would have wanted to have that conversation, but the conversation was not good. It was not a good conversation, but the way that doctor managed to say what was happening, what probably was going to happen, and what they were doing was said with depth and kindness, but absolute clarity despite the unknowns. So the fact that there was no known what's happened, it was said. And it's always been something to me that we can have that first conversation, which was confusing and too full of words, and kind of not giving us as parents the opportunity to really be spoken to as if we would understand, actually minimizing that we could have the capacity to understand, all the way through to that last sort of kind of few days where the information, it's a totally different scenario, I know, but I guess what I wanted to highlight was it's possible to speak about difficult things to people who are hugely invested in a patient or about yourself without things being dumbed down, even if you don't know the answers.
Yeah.
It was a long answer.
No, that was perfect. Pooja, I don't know if you want to come into that, around that concept of, I think that feeling that clinicians have around, I need to dumb this, and I hate the phrase, and I put it in speech marks all the time because I hate it, dumb things down, and actually what that does for that communication.
Yeah, that's such an important learning point, isn't it? And actually, what you've just tried to convey, I know that must have been rather hard to kind of think that through and relive that for a moment. But what you've managed to convey is actually the simple fact that we think about genomics as such a difficult conversation, right? We use the word genetics and genomics loosely, but in reality, we think it's so complicated. We're terrified of how we're going to use those terms and how we're going to simplify those terms. And do we understand it enough to do that? But actually, what you're saying is take the patients along that journey. And it's okay if we're not entirely sure what we're really saying, but actually listen and be a part of that conversation and be upfront and just say, this is where I'm at. It's, it may be that it's uncertain, but this is what I'm hoping to get to at the end of it, and not be bogged down in all the terminology and all the big words and terrifying conversations that we find every day. I hope that kind of represents what you were trying to say.
Absolutely, yeah. It puts it into much kind of, it's just listening, and the fact that the uncertainty, it's okay for there to be uncertainty, it doesn't have to be a kind of walking away from a room with everything, and that there's a door open to come back, actually, and whether that is practical signposting or another appointment, or what will happen. Yeah,
that's really important, isn't it? We get really worried about, actually, we need to get everything across in one moment, and that's all we've got. And of course we do, because we're busy clinicians. But knowing that some things just need to be staged and you've got somewhere to go with those questions is so important. It's a big learning point.
Yeah, thank you so much. Harri, I don't know if you want to give a little bit of info on how you were introduced to genomics.
Yeah, so I think although this is not my viewpoint, I understand that there are a few reasons why patients may not want to be genetically tested. And one of those reasons is fear of what it might say. So I think you as healthcare professionals really need to understand that and start those discussions with that in mind. And I think really also one of the things I have been thinking about is it goes beyond just that conversation, because it's all the conversations you've had before that as well with the patient up until that point. And I say that because if you've established yourself as part of this patient's team, and I'm not talking about a medical team right now, I'm talking about their team, a personal level, I think if you've done that from the very beginning, then anything you say from there is going to be trusted and taken in good faith. And I think that's a really important thing. It's not just about that one discussion. It's about every discussion you've had so far with that patient. And I think also it's really important to say that you just need to be mindful that the world as many patients have known it has just been blown to smithereens. And, you know, they're being asked to make 100 decisions and digest a lot of information in that moment. So it's just about being really mindful of that. And actually, I agree with you completely. You know, don't think you have to dumb it down so much. But equally, I actually think it's also important to make it as simple as possible. So it's about finding that balance between the two, really. So I think if I was to go back to the conversation again, and actually this is sort of how the conversation went. So I had a conversation with our consultant, and he sort of mentioned it to me a little bit in passing, but I have to say I was very quick to be, you know, I think I've written down here, if my consultant or any of our medical team had asked me to sign a form sending Eddie to the moon for better diagnosis, in that moment, I would have signed it. So I was very much on board. But I think the most important thing is to say that you think it's important and why you think it's important. If you know those two things and you've established yourself as someone they trust, that's all that matters, because then as you say, you can keep that door open. And sometimes it takes a moment for families to digest as well. You know, that's a big thing. It's probably something they've never even had to think about before in their lives. And so it may well be that's the only conversation they need. And obviously you can be led by them, but it might be that later on other questions come out.
Yeah. Can I just say, I think that distinction between being simple and clear versus, you know, thinking that you need to dumb something that is different.
Yes.
It's a different concept. We're not talking about being simple and clear doesn't mean treat me like I don't understand.
Exactly.
Pooja, I don't know if that's something you experience in clinic and how you work with families.
Absolutely. I think I have to say that team approach, that's incredible, actually. That's really sat somewhere with me, and I'm going to take that with me, actually, because that is such an important distinction between patient and the clinician, but actually we're in it together, and that is so important. So I think that's my learning for the day. But yes, so simple communication, I think that communication complexity, I think we certainly think about good communication as, right, I've got to really simplify this. I've got to make it very, very, very easy to understand. And that's true, but it doesn't have to be, exactly as you say, it doesn't have to be at the, let's dumb this conversation down. It just needs to make sense to that individual. And that can be in many, many formats. It could just be, you know, in genetic counselling, we use a lot of metaphors. And that's a good thing and that's a bad thing, because some metaphors really don't sit well. You think is making sense and it really doesn't, because if that's not people's understanding of the world, it's not going to make sense. But we always like to try different things. So we'll draw things out and we'll kind of show pictures to see if that makes any sense. And I think it's just kind of being open to say, actually, if this isn't working and it's not clear, let me try something else. Let me make sure that we're in this together and you are able to understand it. And also opening that conversation the other way to say, you feel comfortable enough to say, I don't get this, tell me more. But that timing is so important, right? When is the right time? When you're in the middle of a really crazy busy ward situation, is that the right time to have that conversation, or do you need a quiet space?
I mean, I definitely think a quiet space is always great, but not always possible. I think that there are many factors that will determine whether the conversation lands in the way that you want it to. And sometimes there are also, you know, very urgent decisions to be made. So of course, yes, a quiet, separate conversation away from the 300 forms that you're given and the 400 charities, which are all wonderful. But yes, I would say separate.
I just wanted to come back on something you said there around, sometimes, and I think we've probably all done it in our professional lives, you go in to have a conversation that you know is going to be a hard one, and you come away and you go, I'm not sure if that landed. How would you feel if a healthcare professional kind of not necessarily said it to you in that phrase, but said to you, do you feel like you've got what you needed from this conversation? Is that something that you would appreciate?
Yes. Simple example that happened this morning. I've got 2 5-year-olds, and I said, I'm coming out today and I'm going to talk to, lots of people about Freddie. And I said, there's so many people here and there'll be so many people online. And I said, their answer to me was, oh, Mummy, you're going to be there all night. Because their interpretation of me talking to you all would be one by one. That was a viewpoint from a 5-year-old. Now, we all know we're having a collective conversation, but it's a good point to that people hear things in different ways, and I thought that they would. In my head, it was perfectly obvious that it was going to be a group of people, but they had an idea that somehow we were going to be doing a wedding lineup and I was going to be talking to you all individually, exactly. And I think that, so yes, absolutely yes. I think that team approach is a really helpful way of putting it, because you want to kind of perhaps feel that patients go away feeling like you're on their side. No, obviously you're on their side, but that very simple kind of human, how does that sound? I actually think how did that land is okay, but even just how did that sound? Because you don't know what they heard or what they didn't hear. Because a lot of what is shared, you pick up on a couple of words, maybe, and then you put them together. And if that sentence that you put together when you go home is not what you wanted us to hear, then that's where the misunderstandings and the, kind of the wiggliness of this journey kind of comes in, because, the signposting, the charities, the leaflets, if you get them, I didn't, but if you get them, you've got black and white things to read, but just a simple, how did that sound, I think is, So I've made that far more complicated than it needed to be.
No, not at all.
Yes.
I think also you're right, the signposting, at the end, because I think people do have a tendency to be aware that your time is precious. So we're all there. You guys are there trying to get to the next appointment. We're there being really conscious that we're taking up your time. And so signposting and saying, this is not your only opportunity to ask questions. Go home, digest, have a think. If you need to come back to me, do. Because I'm not sure actually all of us as patients will do that. We'll be concerned that we're, taking up too much of your time. Having said that, I would have done anything for my son. So I would, poor Dr. Bartram probably had 700 emails from me a day, but.
It's okay. He also gets 700 emails a day from me. So Pooja, I guess, for genetic counsellors, you do have that kind of more longer term discussions with families. Is that right? They can come back to you with questions, etc.
Yeah, absolutely. It's really interesting you've just said that people are generally aware of how busy clinicians are. We talk about it all the time. You see us running around from one place to another. You observe it, right? So
we wait in the waiting rooms while you're late.
Precisely. All those hushed conversations in the background, you hear them all. No, absolutely. And the number of times we will say to people, I've told you a lot of, I've given you a lot of information here. There is so much for you to take away. Come back to me. Yes, I'm going to write to you. There's going to be something coming out to you, but these are the ways you can come back to me. And I think that's the crux of it. Many people still don't because they're afraid. They're afraid that they're not going to be really answered, and there's a fear there, I think. But also, I think if I give out a phone number, they're going to go through secretaries and then so-and-so and so-and-so and so-and-so. So actually, perhaps we need to be thinking about an easier way of communication. It might just be a quick question. And if that's what it takes, that's what it should be, because it should be an open dialogue and a conversation, even if it's not going to be immediate as an answer, because we're probably not looking at our emails and all of that. But that's an important point.
I think giving the confidence to patients and families that, you know, any question is valid as well, because I think it's difficult to ask what you don't know about. So if you don't know how to ask what it is, but you just want to say, I just need to know more, it's hard to articulate that. And then if you kind of, you know, widen that out to families that might not feel confident in contacting or following up anyway, or perhaps, you know, language is a barrier, or, you know, even being able to find the letter that you had to come to the appointment that's been scribbled on and you don't know where it is anymore, is, you know, there are blocks that kind of that might seem, you know, kind of simple to overcome, but when you're in an overwhelming situation, very small things become difficult to ask, because it is partially fear. It is, I don't know what I'm going to hear, but it is, I think also it's a kind of how do you question people who obviously know so much more as well? You know, how do you feel empowered? Again, another word we can put on the list of, you know, but how does one feel that their question is worth asking, when, because you can doubt yourself and think, oh, is it, I don't want to waste, can I just creep in and ask a question? But
that's a really good point. And actually there's, as you say, right, you kind of have this expectation that, of course, the health professional knows you know, a lot anyways, and they're probably not everything, but a lot. But actually, every question is so valid, and it's your journey, it's your story, and what I think we need to potentially consider is actually how approachable are we, and even just saying something as simple as, "No question, silly."
Yeah. Thank you so much for all of that. We've touched a little bit on it as we've spoken, but we know that language is so important, and Amber, you know, we've spoken about this a lot, about how those kind of small parts of language can make a really big difference in those conversations. And are there any like key things around language that you would really like people in our audience to remember when they're talking to families? And are there any kind of major red flags for you as you've been through this process that are things that immediately put you in not the best headspace for those kind of conversations? Harri, did you want to go first?
Yeah, sure. So I would say language is absolutely key. If we go back to fear being a huge barrier to entry, the way you talk about testing is going to be paramount to allaying fears and concerns. I think for me as a patient or a patient parent, it's scary to think that the test might give you worse news. So for me, it was about, you know, Eddie's diagnosis and whether it was going to be, you know, more aggressive, but also it provided potential answers on whether Leo, my other son, might be more susceptible to this type of cancer. So you're already in a situation where your whole world has been blown apart, and then it's kind of terrifying to think that this test could double down on that. So in my opinion, you really need to focus on the positives. So for me, and the way that I've sort of been thinking about it, the test did two things. It was either going to provide reassurance or it was going to provide an opportunity to react. And those two things are actually both reassuring, if you think about it. So for us, it provided reassurance, but I think it's about emphasizing that more information for you guys means better treatment plans and better outcomes for patients. And I think the more I was thinking about it as well, sorry, this is a bit of a long one, but
not at all.
It's about knowing all the information you can at the start, or all of us can as the team, and perhaps emphasizing that it can help unexpected surprises. So this is basically a controlled surprise. And to be honest, I imagine the psychology of being in control of a surprise is quite good for parents at that point. I would have liked it. I did like it. I thought, you know what? If I'm going to know something, I want to be in control of that. I don't want this to come out, you know, months down the line and I didn't know. So I don't know whether that's something that is useful, but yeah, it might be something that helps with that sort of like, oh, do I want to hear the surprise? Well, at least you're in control of it.
Do you know that word empowerment is coming up again, isn't it?
Oh, yeah.
It really is. It's we're turning this into a little theme, actually. But that's what it sounds like to me. You know, it's that where everything else is out of your control, this is giving you that little bit to hold on to and empowering you, whatever that information is. And it might take a while to get there and process, but it's there and you could do something with it.
Amber.
Yeah, I mean, I tend to give big answers. I'll try and keep this. And maybe this, you know, there's potential for this to be emotional. So yeah,
that's okay. Take your time.
Yeah, I'm fine with that. I hope you are. I think yeah, I'm thinking about kind of being given results, particularly around language. I think that you know, kind of when this end of my knowledge, this side, you know, kind of having those sort of very simplified kind of yes, no, maybe is one thing. But when maybe, I mean, I'm talking about, you know, VUS or, you know, there being other testing that would be required, familial testing or otherwise, or, you know, kind of ongoing testing, that kind of maybe could be a no and it could be a yes. And we were told emphatically no. And it was misunderstood at the point where we were given the results, because more testing was suggested, and our doctor, I mean, we were in a complicated situation, again, not perhaps typical, but because I'm not typical doesn't mean to say that it doesn't happen. You know, we were having results being given to us after our child had died. So this test was, you know, you've heard this morning about, you know, the journey of a, you know, if you imagine that while that testing kind of results are coming through, we're in hospital again and we're in hospital again and we're having conversations about, you know, so what will ongoing treatment be? Everything was paused because we were waiting for this testing, which, you know, is a separate point. But in terms of kind of the results being given, I'm just sort of hesitating because I'm trying to think how the most sort of in a nutshell way to sort of put it. If you say no, there has to be, you know, kind of real evidence for that. If it is a maybe, there has to be a we don't know behind that. And I know that's sort of drilling into kind of those potential results quite sort of deeply. But I asked my husband about this, because we were Freddie's team, right? So he said that, I'll read what he wrote, because he sent this to me yesterday. My takeaway is that even though the language can be changed and simplified, results can be nuanced, and that requesting clinicians should either be proficient in interpreting the results or seek genetic counsellors to relay these results to families. And are there any big no's, I said? Using absolutes when discussing results, specifically on unknown significance, is clearly wrong. I mean, we are kind of, I don't want to kind of take the time up with, things that perhaps could have been done differently for Freddie. But if I wish there was something in our journey that I could change, it would be that the clinicians that we met before he died would have recognised the fact that having an absolute answer to his problems wasn't going to make his life any easier. And so therefore, by not telling us, it made things more complicated. And to go one step further, when asked afterwards, kind of why the doctor didn't share suspicions, presumably very strong suspicions, that Freddie had Dravet and was going to come back with some indication of an SC1A change, she stated that it would have been too distressing for us to hear that because of the trajectory of Dravet as a life-limiting condition. And I just want to let that settle for a minute and to repeat it and say it a different way round. A doctor chose not to tell a child's parents of the possible trajectory of a condition because they thought it would be too distressing. And I suppose the question there is it too distressing for the doctor as well? And is that a choice that the doctor should be making, to use language to, kind of take that understanding in a different direction? It's a difficult thing to kind of articulate. I hope I've done an okay version of what I meant to say.
It
I'm
really
going to
does.
kind of hand it. Pooja knows what I'm trying to say. I mean, can I ask you to kind of comment on what I've said, maybe? Because maybe that helps me to hear that I've managed to explain myself, if that makes sense. Yeah.
Absolutely. I'm going to start by saying, actually, you did a beautiful job there. And actually, whilst it probably still feels sometimes unclear, whilst you're processing that, and even, time's gone on and you're still processing that, each time it probably still feels unclear. Part of it is around that last point that you've just made is, whose information was it? Was it, the genetic information that sat with the clinician, whether it sat with the scientist, or whether it was your information to have in the first place? But just to clarify, I think what you would, the story around the uncertain results was around a variant of uncertain significance that needed further testing in the family. And at that point, it wasn't a clear no. So it was, don't know at the moment. And that's the part that was the challenge, right? Because it was the uncertainty that wasn't necessarily communicated, and it was very much a decision that was made. The key point, I suppose, to think about there is what part of it was the clinician not being confident? What part of it was that saving of distress, and whichever way round we look at it from both perspectives. But actually the point you mention is, the key bit around, at the end of the day, it would have been that hope that was given to you up front, and then that wasn't there at the end. And part of that journey could have been changed through that open, honest communication, even if it was uncertain.
Yeah, and I actually think this brings us really nicely onto that kind of next bit of the conversation that we talked around, Pooja, yourself, our clinical geneticists, some of the people in this room have a real expertise in genomics. But we do know that as genomic testing becomes more and more embedded into kind of NHS care, becomes embedded into more and more pathways, there are going to be people and healthcare professionals talking to families who maybe don't have a background in genomics. They haven't come through years of genomics training. And we're working to bring that education. But there are probably going to be questions that you ask that they may not be able to answer there and then on the spot. And I guess my question to you, as patients, families of patients, parents, is how would you like healthcare professionals to deal with that situation? If you ask them a question and they just don't know because it's not their area of expertise, like how would you like them to approach that conversation with you? Amber, I'll come to you first.
I think knowing everything. I mean, it's an obvious thing to say, isn't it? You can't know everything. And I don't think patients, carers, families expect everybody but a specialist to have answers for everything. I think from a family's perspective, having confidence in somebody saying, do you know what, I don't know that, but I'm going to find out. And I have a colleague I can get in touch with, or there's a support network that I can find out more. I'm not quite sure how long that will take, but I'm going to keep your question in mind. Is something that would go some way to send that family away that day feeling like, yeah, someone's on my team. I think that Pooja and I did some work a year or so ago, maybe a bit longer, on the reporting of germline results and how to best deliver results. And the idea was that it was for healthcare professionals who may not have a specific expertise in genomics, so much wider. Those resources are out there, they're being thought about and they're provided. And I guess it's a bit like, when you do first aid training, you need to do it again, right? You're not expecting to do first aid training and still remember everything 20 years later. I mean, you guys may, but kind of, I guess it's the expectation that healthcare professionals aren't going to be caught out by not knowing everything, and that their questions won't reveal that they aren't certain, or that, kind of, perhaps that's a culture thing. you know, kind of being confident enough to say, actually, you know, I just need to clarify this. My patient wanted to know more, and I didn't have the answers, because nobody wants to hear a fudged version of, you know, how somebody thinks genetics works. It has to be right, even if it needs to be outsourced.
Yeah, I think you'll damage confidence more by fudging something than by saying, I don't know this. Certainly, you know, if there's one thing you want to be in your medical professionals, it's confidence. So I would much rather hear, I don't know this. I think from the outset, what I would say is, you know, be clear about what you know, and then be honest about the fact that it's not your field of expertise, but that you understand the importance of it. So you might not be the expert on genomics, but you might be the expert on the patient, and you might be their most trusted person. So the power that you have is enormous. So if genomics is something you think is important, then make sure they know that, and make sure you are able to simply communicate why. I think that would be the main thing for me. And then in terms of how I want to deal with, you know, if you didn't know something, I think exactly as Amber said, but also, you know, potentially, I think there's two routes, I guess. One is you go away and you find out and come back to your patient, or you suggest that they talk to someone like Pooja who, you know, has that expertise. They might want to talk to you specifically, or they might want to talk to the person in particular. And that's just something that maybe the patient would share with you if you open that up as an opportunity to.
Yeah.
Can I add something?
Yeah, please do.
You know, this morning, the session about, well, first of all, the introduction of what, you know, kind of was achieved in 2024, but also kind of hearing about innovation and new testing, and, you know, kind of how responsive this part of medicine needs to be, I think is almost sort of, it's a dual thing, right? Like, there's so much to keep on learning. I can't even imagine. And I think that it's, rather than coming at it in a linear way of like, you learn everything and, you know, full stop, and then it's put into practice, your patients are teaching you things all the time, because science catches up with what you can learn about them, right? So if you broaden that out to the kind of team analogy, it's, you know, it's a big team, isn't it? So I mean, that's in an ideal world. We're not in an ideal world. And, you know, kind of a clinic day doesn't run on ideal timing. And, you know, kind of, there are all sorts of things that, you know, when you step out of a hospital, you think, yeah, that's great to perhaps bring back in. And then the grind starts again. But I imagine, I think that being able to view progress as something that has to be topped up on is essential to be able to kind of from a population point of view, have confidence in the fact that, you know, it's not always going to come top down. It's going to come from other community clinics. It's going to come from other ways that people access healthcare.
Yeah. And I think actually what's really interesting is what you just said there about how, you know, sometimes when you listen into those talks, you think, oh, it's kind of overwhelming how quickly things innovate and develop and change in the field of genomics. And I imagine for you know, some of the healthcare professionals in the audience and some of the people listening online, that is how they feel too when they look at genomics. Often the feedback we get is, sort of don't know where to start. I really didn't learn much about this in my training, and it feels overwhelming. And actually, I think having that almost like reassurance from you as patients and families that that's okay to you if you're honest about that. It doesn't disrupt a trust that you have. You would much rather have that honesty and, like you said, go on that journey together. And I also really like your when Amber, you were saying about, I'm going to go away and I'm going to find this out, giving that quantifiable, I don't know how long this will take, or this is the route I know I'm going to go down, or I don't, as much information to you as possible about what that process of finding out looks like to them, so that it's not just an empty saying. Pooja, I mean, I guess you often get questions from clinicians that are, I've had a patient ask X, what do I say? Is that something you're seeing more and more of?
Certainly, and actually, just a little plug there. I know Ailey was doing this very early, earlier in the session. Genetic counselors, clinical genetics, we're all here, and we're your friendly local clinical genetics team. Pick up the phone to us, drop us an email. We're open to asking questions. Don't feel you're isolated. It is terrifying. Because it is so quick and we're learning every day, and potentially there's going to be situations where you might come across something that you're never going to see again. So where do you start with that? And if it's any reassurance, we don't know everything either. And we often have those conversations, and again, it's a part of being a part of that big team, and that includes the patients, the families, and the wider healthcare providers for that individual.
I wanted to ask a similar question, which was, are you noticing a change in who is asking you questions? So, is it just broader kind of professionals with not such specific genomics background?
Yeah.
Is it consultants? Is it, kind of other, are you finding that you have emails that say, I just want to check something? And is it from everyone? It's, I think it's helpful to hear that.
Absolutely. And actually the trend is changing, and you'll get different levels of questions. You get them from, people out there in the community, to primary care, to senior consultants, to trainees, everyone. And I'm pretty sure my scientist colleagues also get those questions all the time when they get those reports, because they're then going back and saying, I don't get it. What do I do? And all of us kind of, we're developing more and more of these multidisciplinary team meetings to have exactly those conversations and be open about what we do know, what we don't know, and how do we get to where we need to get to. And it's just doing more and more and more of that.
And what is the most common question that people want clarity, that professionals come, what kind of area is it within this very specific area? But is there something that kind of springs to mind that you think, I answer that more than, or, kind of a collective subject,
I think as genetic counselors, the question that we often get is, I've got this result. How do I get this across? What does this mean for my patient? But what does this mean for the family? And how are they going to be able to approach genetics? How are they going to be able to get referred to clinical genetics? How long is that going to take? Because once you start that journey, then you want to know the next step, and you want to get on that next train. And that's quite often the question that comes along.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. And I think, again, maybe that's something, for us to take away as a service is, are we providing that information clearly about, what is the process for clinicians once they've done that results, even then, I'm just thinking, we talked about, that prostate cancer pathway, and, we get to a point where for us, it goes, okay, well, that's the end of the pathway, but actually it isn't. It's a continuous pathway, and what are the next steps, and what are the questions that might come back further down the line? I think that's a really interesting thing for us to think about collectively. Sort of changing kind of tact slightly into a space that I know, when we talk to the general public, when we go to speak at events, some of the questions that we often get from people in the audience is all around, those data concerns. We know that genomic data can feel like a big and scary thing, and I'm interested to understand from both of you when that happened to you in that moment, and you're taking in such complex information, you're in a fast-moving, unexpected place. Do those data concerns crop into your head when you talk about genomics, or is it something that happens kind of further down the line? Or, I'm really interested to understand that kind of perspective.
For me, no. I am probably too forgiving to think anyone would ever take my son's genomic data. So I know that I am not the normal public opinion, probably. I can understand it. But for me, the thought of Eddie's genomic data being available to be part of studies or anything else that might help other children in Eddie's situation with better treatment plans or better outcomes was enough to make me feel that none of those other things were a legitimate concern. However, and I have to say that in having to sort of prepare some of the answers, what I've realized is that it can be incredibly fuzzy what you remember from the very beginning. But I believe you can limit how the data is used. I thought we had to sign two things. One that said we wanted it done, and the other to say that you could keep the data. Is that correct? And so if that is the case, then that should be explained up front, because it's something that obviously would overcome some of those concerns.
Yeah, and for context in the room, I know Harri previously.
Sorry, I don't know if I need to explain anything else.
So your son Eddie took part in a research study all around kind of his genomic data. So Jack Bartram, a consultant at Gosh, used Eddie's data as part of that research study. So there's that kind of extra layer of consent and talking about how that data will be used. But Pooja, you'll probably know the more normal.
I think you're thinking about that consent process when you're consenting for whole genome sequencing. So you've got the two elements there. You've got clinical consent as to you want to find out a reason why this is happening in current live situation. And then that sort of research section around, okay, this may or may not help at the moment and I might get a clinical answer or not, but actually do I want that sample to be used longer term to answer those questions that you were just saying, does it help someone else in the future? And absolutely, those are two separate parts of the consent, and you can certainly opt in or opt out of it. And there are, of course, controls in terms of who accesses that research information, who has access to the data. But I suppose the question there is is there an element of trust there? And that's why you go and say, I'm okay with that. I absolutely trust that this is going to be used appropriately. And when there are fears out there in the world around data, is it because they just don't know, or is there an element of trust?
I definitely think it goes back to, again, it's the person who has asked you or the person who's provided this information. It goes back to being a trusted person of their team. I mean, there's not a lot that, our consultant could have said that I wouldn't have followed wholeheartedly, because I truly believed in him. And I believed he was part of Eddie's wider team, not just medical team. The reason why I go to team is because, I almost want to say family. And I know that almost sounds, it sounded wrong, but it almost sounds like, it's a patient and a doctor, and that sounds kind of weird, but genuinely that's how he made me feel, us feel as a family. And so when I was having these conversations, I was in a completely different space to maybe other people who have had these conversations with people they don't trust as much.
Yeah. Amber.
Yeah, I think you've got two people here that would have said yes at that point. But trying to kind of think about how, you know, the kind of the wider perception of data and storage and what happens, and you know, it's a bit like going back to that point I said before, that you can't ask questions if you don't know what you're asking. And so I wonder if, you know, the gap that perhaps, you know, can hopefully be filled or backfilled even, is, you know, kind of creating enough of a kind of public dialogue that this isn't something that needs to be, you know, kind of questioned as if it's suspicious, because we're on the other side of that viewpoint, and so it's hard to kind of put myself there. But one thing I do kind of I notice from, you know, things I watch or read, or even, you know, kind of how I have, you know, targeted posts because of what I'm reading. So, you know, there I am getting, you know, things to review from you guys, and I'm having to Google words because I'm thinking, I don't know what this means. And then, of course, you know, right back at me comes suggested reading or other posts. Is you know, kind of, I mean, that's interesting in itself, because, you know, what you read is then what you're fed. But, you know, I see frequently recently kind of links for the DNA children and young people's
Decipher
health, health resource.
It's a biobank of DNA storage for anyone in the
now,
audience.
I guess I'm a target audience for that, right? And you know, it is something I've looked at. I've got 2 5-year-olds. You know, it's a side note to say, because I'm sure it would be interesting to hear, you know, that we've had other family testing since Freddie's death. You know, I had a twin pregnancy. We were very worried about, you know, whether my boys would have also the same genetic change in the SCN1A gene as Freddie did. They were tested with cord blood just for that specific change, and it was a no, and that's all I needed to know. But I do think I would sign them up, you know, because for me, I see the value in the fact that, you know, it's useful, and what wasn't there for Freddie, you know, kind of 8 years is a long time as well, but, you know, kind of the amount of, you know, kind of genes included in various epilepsy panels has risen, you know, kind of massively in that time. So, you know, I'm reading it at a deeper level, but just to kind of put, you know, that targeted kind of social media post, it's kind of, and I guess it makes me think about the fact that, okay, so the recruitment is quite nuanced then. If it needs to keep, you know, we need you to sign up, we need you to sign up, you know, we're looking for families to do this. And yeah, I don't know what the answer is, but it's just, you know, what I notice from my own daily kind of engagement.
I think one also thing to say, and I don't know how it fits into the conversation, but I think we've both had very specific experiences, different experiences, but very specific experiences, which lend themselves to being very open to genetic testing.
Yeah.
And continue to be open to genetic testing going forwards as well. You know, I wouldn't hesitate if Leo needed it for some reason, but just to say, be mindful that not everyone is like us. The way that I always try and explain Eddie's cancer diagnosis and what that has meant for us as a family is that we're all in the world standing on a trapdoor. And when you get a diagnosis, which is so catastrophic, whatever that is, that door opens and you start free falling. And then that door is closed again when things are under control, like they were for Eddie. But you always recognize that door is there. But you have a whole bunch of people who haven't had that trap door opened yet. Lots of them will only be on the first step of that journey of maybe finding out if there is a trap door underneath them. So just to say, be mindful that not everyone's going to be as open and wholeheartedly accepting of it as we are.
Yeah.
I was thinking as well as the project with the inherited cardiac conditions that's trialing with the coroner's courts.
Yeah.
Where, you know, kind of a coronary death is discussed with family members to see if family want to also be tested for potential genetic changes. I mean, it's a kind of, it's a sub conversation to all of this, but you know, with that comes two camps as well. You know, do you say yes because of course you're caring about everybody in your family and you want to know? Do you say no because you're worried about either knowing or what happens to that data? You know, kind of, you want to have a kind of, it comes back down to information, I think, but not information just being given at the point of choice, information being given in a more kind of digestible format for everybody.
Yeah, and I guess having that conversation that it's okay that there are those two sometimes really opposed views, and you might have both of them in going on in your head at the same time, and that is perfectly normal and okay.
I don't know how much time we have, but just to also mention, going back to that with, so one of the things obviously with my situation was that it was the genetic testing that we had was going to tell us potentially about, you know, my other son, but also that had wider implications for our family because it could have told us about other people in our family, you know, my nieces and nephews, for example. And so that obviously opens discussions about whether the other family would want to know. So again, these are all discussions that are possible things that may come up in your experience, and are all reasons why actually some people might say no or be really reticent to say yes. And I do get it, particularly if you're not in the scenario. You know, maybe my if I'd explained this to my sister-in-law, she might have said, no, I don't want to know, because she wasn't in that situation. But anyway, it's just to say that those are other things that you might be considering as a patient parent.
Yeah. And Pooja, you must have these conversations, you know, when you meet patients and families all the time. Like you said, if we're using your trapdoor analogy, which you know I love, it isn't just a trapdoor that you're opening or for yourself. You might be opening that up for a lot of other people, and that, I imagine, Pooja, you must have people feel like that's quite a weight to bear almost.
It is, especially during a time when you're just about dealing with what you're dealing with. So not only are you saying, actually, I'm going to potentially find an answer, and maybe that's a good thing, and maybe I'll get to the next step where there might be some better management, some better treatment, but then I'm going to have those hard conversations. And the worry about how the family might view it, even though what you're trying to do is empower them, it could open up a can of worms that, you know, we're not individuals in the society, are we? Families are such complex structures, and we all come with that history of what those family structures look like. And it might be easier to have that conversation with one member of that family, but not so much with the other because there's been a dispute or, you know, something's not quite gone well.
Or an assumption that some parts of the family don't need to know. So I'm thinking of a conversation I've had recently with a bereaved dad who heard within his family there had been communication of a cardiology-related change in a distant family member, elderly family member, and it only was communicated to other elderly family members. And, you know, unfortunately, the person that was most affected by that gene change was a young man who had no knowledge that he was, you know, affected by a gene change, and it, you know, it didn't filter down, because you don't necessarily think that, you know, a strapping 18-year-old needs to bear that in mind.
Because actually there's a protection mechanism, isn't it, for families? We kind of want to protect people from difficult conversations and difficult information. And you're thinking, if this 18-year-old doesn't need to know, they have a whole life ahead of them. The reality is all you're trying to do is protect them. But actually the crux of it is relevant. But how do you balance out what is relevant and important, even if it's a hard conversation for it to go through, and it's potentially going to be burdensome, not only for the person who's sharing the information, but the person who's receiving that information, to then have to make those difficult decisions. Comes back to the same point: whose information is it?
Yeah. I'm just aware of the time.
Could go on.
I know. I guess wrapping up from me, I want to just say a huge thank you to both of you. This is the best bit of my job. I always feel so privileged to get to meet people like you, meet families like yours. So I want to thank you, and I want to thank Eddie and Freddie, because this is also thanks to them. We do have a few minutes. I'm going to do roving reporter style, because we only have this mic. If anyone in the audience has any questions, I know that we've covered a lot of topics.